Sarah Martinez had dreamed of becoming a Navy SEAL since she was 12 years old. Growing up in a small Texas town, she spent countless hours practicing with her father's hunting rifle in their backyard. Her aim was perfect, her focus unbreakable, and her determination stronger than steel. But when she finally made it through the grueling SEAL training program, becoming one of the first women ever to earn the Trident, the welcome she received was far from warm. The men in her unit looked at her like she was a mistake waiting to happen. During briefings, they would exchange glances and smirk when she spoke. In the mess hall, conversations would stop when she sat down, only to resume in hushed whispers. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, seemed to tolerate her presence rather than embrace it. "Martinez," Brooks would say during training exercises, "try to keep up with the real soldiers." The other SEALs laughed at his comments, but Sarah never let it show on her face. She had learned early in life that showing weakness only invited more attacks. Instead, she focused on being better than everyone else. While her teammates slept, she practiced. While they relaxed, she studied enemy tactics and improved her marksmanship. Her specialty became long-range precision shooting. Sarah could hit targets that others couldn't even see clearly through their scopes. She studied wind patterns, calculated bullet drop with mathematical precision, and learned to control her breathing and heartbeat to an almost supernatural degree. Her instructors were amazed, but her fellow SEALs remained skeptical. "Lucky shots," Sergeant Williams would mutter after watching her nail impossible targets during training. "Probably had help setting up the shot," another would add. Sarah ignored their comments and continued improving. She knew that one day her skills would be put to the ultimate test, and she wanted to be ready. That day came sooner than expected when their unit received orders for a high-stakes mission in Eastern Europe. Intelligence reports indicated that a dangerous terrorist leader named Viktor Kozlov had been spotted in a remote mountain compound. Kozlov was responsible for several attacks on American interests and had evaded capture for over 3 years. The mission was simple in concept, but incredibly difficult in execution. Eliminate Kozlov and his key lieutenants while they attended a secret meeting. The compound was situated on a mountainside, surrounded by dense forest and natural barriers that made a direct assault nearly impossible. The only viable approach was through precision sniper fire from an adjacent peak, approximately 100 to 200 meters away. It was an extremely challenging shot under the best conditions, but the weather forecast showed high winds and intermittent snow. During the mission briefing, Colonel Brooks outlined the plan. "We need someone who can make an impossible shot under terrible conditions. The target window will be approximately 30 seconds when Kozlov appears on the compound's balcony for his daily security check." The room fell silent as everyone considered the difficulty of the task. Williams raised his hand. "Sir, I volunteer for the primary sniper position." Brooks nodded. "Williams, you'll take the shot. Martinez, you'll be his spotter." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She knew she was the best marksman in the unit, but once again she was being relegated to a support role simply because she was a woman. However, she also knew that arguing would only make things worse. "Sir," she said calmly, "with respect, my accuracy scores are higher than Williams in long-range precision shooting, especially under adverse weather conditions." The room erupted in snickers and comments. Williams turned red with anger. "You think you're better than me, princess?" Brooks held up his hand for silence. "Martinez, Williams has more field experience. That's my decision." 2 days later, the team was inserted into the mountains under cover of darkness. They hiked for 6 hours through treacherous terrain, carrying all their equipment and supplies. Sarah carried not only her own gear, but also backup ammunition and communication equipment, determined to prove she could handle anything the mission threw at her. The sniper position was a narrow ledge carved into the rock face, barely wide enough for 2 people to lie prone. Williams set up his rifle while Sarah positioned herself with the spotting scope and range-finding equipment. The wind was howling, and snow had begun to fall more heavily than the weather reports had predicted. Williams attempted several practice shots at targets of opportunity, but the conditions were making accurate fire nearly impossible. His shots were consistently off target, sometimes by several feet. Sarah watched through her scope, calculating wind speed and direction, temperature variations, and the effect of the falling snow on bullet trajectory. "Wind is gusting from the northwest at 25 to 30 miles per hour, she reported. "You need to adjust your aim point approximately 8 feet to the right and 2 feet high to compensate." Williams ignored her corrections. "I know how to shoot, Martinez. Just do your job and spot for me." Hours passed with no sign of the target. The weather continued to deteriorate, and Williams was becoming increasingly frustrated with the conditions. His confidence was clearly shaken by the missed practice shots, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into his movements. Finally, at 1400 hours, their communication radio crackled with the signal they had been waiting for. Kozlov was moving toward the balcony for his scheduled security check. This was their moment. Sarah watched through her spotting scope as a figure appeared on the distant balcony. "Target acquired," she whispered into her microphone. "Range 1,247 meters. Wind northwest at 30 miles per hour, gusting to 35. Snow is affecting visibility and trajectory." Williams lined up his shot, but his hands were trembling slightly from the cold and stress. Sarah could see that his calculations were wrong, but he had stopped listening to her corrections hours ago. "Taking the shot," Williams announced. The rifle cracked, echoing across the valley. Through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet impact harmlessly into the stone wall several feet from where Kozlov stood. The terrorist leader immediately dove for cover and disappeared back into the building. "Miss," Sarah reported, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. Williams cursed loudly. "The wind shifted at the last second." But Sarah knew the truth. The wind hadn't shifted. Williams had simply made the wrong calculations and ignored her spotting corrections. Their primary mission objective had failed because of pride and prejudice rather than lack of skill or preparation. As they prepared to evacuate the position, Sarah's mind was already working on alternative plans. She knew Kozlov would be more cautious now, but she also knew his patterns from studying intelligence reports. There might still be a chance to complete the mission, but it would require convincing her superiors to trust her abilities rather than dismissing them. The team regrouped at their temporary base camp, a small cave system 3 miles from the target compound. Colonel Brooks was furious about the missed shot, and the atmosphere was tense as they discussed their options. Intelligence reported that Kozlov had increased security and changed his routine after the failed assassination attempt. "We may have lost our best chance," Brooks said, pacing back and forth in the cramped cave. "Kozlov knows we're here now. He'll be much more careful about exposing himself." Williams sat in the corner, cleaning his rifle and avoiding eye contact with everyone. His failure had shaken his confidence, and it showed in his slumped shoulders and quiet demeanor. The other team members were discussing alternative approaches, but none seemed viable given their limited resources and the increased security around the compound. Sarah studied the topographical maps and intelligence photos spread across a flat rock. She had been analyzing Kozlov's patterns for weeks before the mission, and she noticed something that others had missed. There was a secondary building about 400 meters from the main compound where Kozlov conducted private meetings with his financial backers. "Sir," she said, pointing to the photographs, "Kozlov has a pattern of visiting this smaller building every morning at 600 hours for exactly 15 minutes. Intelligence reports show he uses this time to review financial documents away from his main security detail." Brooks looked at the photos skeptically. "That building is even more exposed than the main compound. There's no cover for a sniper approach within reasonable range." Sarah had already considered this problem. There's an old communications tower approximately 800 meters northeast of that position. The tower appears abandoned, but it would provide an elevated shooting position with clear line of sight. 800 meters in these weather conditions? Brooks shook his head. That's an extremely difficult shot, especially with the target exposure time of only 15 minutes. I can make that shot, Sarah said quietly, but with complete confidence. The cave fell silent except for the sound of wind whistling through the entrance. Williams looked up from his rifle with anger flashing in his eyes. You couldn't even spot correctly for me, and now you think you can make a shot I missed? The shot you missed was because you ignored the spotting corrections I gave you, Sarah replied calmly. Your bullet impact was exactly where I predicted it would be based on your aim point. Brooks held up his hand before the argument could escalate. Even if you could make the shot, Martinez, approaching that tower would require crossing open ground in daylight. It's too risky. But Sarah had already worked out the approach route. There's a drainage ravine that runs along the northeast slope. It would provide concealment for most of the approach, and the final 200 meters could be covered during the early morning fog that forms in this valley every day around 500 hours. She spread out additional maps showing the terrain in detail. Her preparation was thorough, and her plan was solid. The other team members began studying her proposed route with growing interest. Sergeant Chen, the team's demolitions expert, nodded slowly. The approach could work. I've been watching the fog patterns since we arrived, and they're very predictable. Brooks remained hesitant. This is a one-shot opportunity, Martinez. If you miss, Kozlov will disappear completely, and this whole mission will be a failure. I won't miss, Sarah said with quiet determination. The next morning, Sarah began her approach to the communications tower at 0400 hours. She moved like a ghost through the darkness, using every piece of cover the terrain provided. Her movements were smooth and deliberate, each step planned to minimize noise and avoid detection. The drainage ravine provided excellent concealment, but it was also treacherous in the darkness. Loose rocks threatened to create noise with every step, and the narrow channel forced her to crawl for long distances. Her knees and elbows were soon scraped and bleeding from the rough stone, but she ignored the discomfort. As predicted, thick fog began forming in the valley at 0500 hours. Sarah used this natural concealment to cross the final stretch of open ground to the base of the communications tower. The structure was old and partially rusted, but it appeared structurally sound enough to support her weight. Climbing the tower in the fog was incredibly dangerous. The metal rungs were slippery with moisture, and visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Sarah climbed slowly and carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with her full weight. Her rifle and equipment added significant weight to her already challenging ascent. At approximately 100 feet above ground level, she found the perfect shooting position. The tower's framework provided natural support for her rifle, and the height gave her a clear angle down to the target building. She set up her equipment with practiced efficiency, checking and double-checking every component. Through her scope, she could see the small building where Kozlov conducted his morning meetings. The range was exactly 847 meters, and the angle was slightly downward, which would affect her bullet trajectory calculations. She began taking detailed measurements of wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. At 0545 hours, Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the observation team positioned on a distant ridge. Target compound shows normal activity. No sign of increased security around the secondary building. Sarah made final adjustments to her scope and settled into her shooting position. Her breathing became slow and controlled, and her heart rate dropped as she entered the focused mental state that had made her such an exceptional marksman. She visualized the shot in her mind, accounting for every variable that could affect the bullet's path. At exactly 0600 hours, the door of the small building opened. Sarah watched through her scope as Kozlov emerged, flanked by two bodyguards who remained outside while he entered the building alone. This was exactly the pattern that intelligence had reported. "Target entering the building," she whispered into her radio. "Beginning countdown for target window." Sarah knew that Kozlov would spend exactly 15 minutes in the building before returning outside. During that time, there would be approximately a 10-second window when he would be exposed as he walked from the building entrance to his waiting vehicle. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Sarah remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing and maintaining her shooting position. The slightest movement could throw off her aim at this distance, so she had to become like a statue, moving only her eyes and finger when the moment came. At 06:15 hours, movement appeared at the building entrance. Sarah's radio crackled with confirmation from the observation team. "Target emerging from building. You have the shot." Through her scope, Sarah could see Kozlov clearly as he stepped outside. He paused for a moment, scanning the area with the practiced caution of someone who had survived many assassination attempts. His bodyguards flanked him, but their positions left a clear shot to center mass. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger as she made final calculations for the shot. Wind speed had decreased slightly, but the atmospheric conditions remained stable. Her crosshairs settled on the target as her breathing slowed to an almost meditative rhythm. This was the moment that would define not only the success of their mission, but also her entire career as a Navy SEAL. Everything she had trained for, all the doubt and skepticism she had endured, came down to this single shot across nearly 850 meters of mountain air. Sarah's finger squeezed the trigger with the same smooth precision she had practiced thousands of times. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and the sharp crack of the gunshot echoed across the valley. Through her scope, she watched as Viktor Kozlov dropped instantly, the bullet finding its mark with deadly accuracy. "Target down," she whispered into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Chaos erupted around the small building as Kozlov's bodyguards scrambled for cover, shouting orders into their radios. But it was too late. Their leader was dead, and the woman they would have dismissed as harmless had delivered the killing shot from nearly half a mile away. Sarah quickly broke down her equipment and began her descent from the communications tower. The fog was beginning to lift, which meant she needed to reach the drainage ravine before her position became visible to enemy forces. Her movements were swift but controlled, each step calculated to avoid detection. As she reached the base of the tower, her radio crackled with urgent messages. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the main compound. Enemy forces are mobilizing for a search pattern." Sarah moved through the drainage ravine like water flowing downhill, using every shadow and depression to avoid detection. Behind her, she could hear the distant sound of vehicles and shouting voices as Kozlov's men began their hunt for the sniper who had killed their leader. The extraction point was still 2 miles away, and Sarah knew that every minute increased the danger for her entire team. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the ache in her legs from the previous day's infiltration. 20 minutes later, she reached the rendezvous point where the rest of her team was waiting. Colonel Brooks looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect that she had never seen before. "Confirmed kill?" he asked. "Confirmed," Sarah replied, handing him the memory card from her scope camera that had recorded the entire shot. The team immediately began moving toward their primary extraction point, but their radio communications brought disturbing news. Enemy forces had anticipated their most likely escape routes and had positioned blocking forces along the main extraction routes. "We have a problem," Brooks announced as they paused in a dense grove of trees. "Intelligence reports that Kozlov's second-in-command, Major Petrov, has taken control of the search operation. This guy is former Spetsnaz and knows exactly how Special Forces teams operate." Sarah studied their map while listening to the radio chatter from enemy forces. Petrov was coordinating his men with military precision, setting up checkpoints and search patterns that would make their planned extraction extremely difficult. "Sir," Sarah said, pointing to an alternative route on the map. "There's a back trail that leads to a secondary extraction point, but it requires crossing a bridge that's likely to be guarded." Brooks shook his head. "Too risky. We'll have to wait for nightfall and try to slip through their search pattern." But waiting wasn't really an option. Enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions, and their temporary hiding spot would be discovered soon. Sarah realized they needed a bold plan to break through the encirclement. "What if we create a distraction?" she suggested. "I could position myself to provide covering fire while the rest of the team moves to the extraction point." "Absolutely not," Brooks replied firmly. "We don't leave anyone behind." However, as the hours passed, it became clear that they were running out of options. Enemy forces had tightened their search pattern, and the team's position was becoming more precarious with each passing hour. Then Sarah's radio picked up a transmission that changed everything. It was Major Petrov himself, speaking in accented English on an open frequency that he knew American forces would be monitoring. "I know you can hear me, American sniper," Petrov's voice crackled through the static. "The woman who killed Kozlov. I know it was a woman because no man could have made that shot under those conditions." The rest of the team looked at Sarah with amazement. Even their enemies recognized the skill required for her successful shot. Petrov continued his transmission. "I have studied your military records, Sarah Martinez, your marksmanship scores, your training records. You are impressive. But now you are trapped, and my men will find you soon." Sarah grabbed the radio handset, ignoring Brooks's gesture to stop her. "This is Sergeant Martinez. What do you want?" "Ah, the famous lady sniper speaks," Petrov replied, with what sounded like amusement. "I want to make you an offer. Surrender yourself, and I will allow your team to leave safely. You have my word as a soldier." "No deal," Sarah replied immediately. Brooks tried to take the radio, but Sarah moved away from him. She was beginning to formulate a plan that might save her entire team, but it would require taking an enormous personal risk. "Think carefully, Sergeant Martinez," Petrov continued. "My men have found your primary extraction point. They have found your secondary extraction point. You are surrounded with no way out, but I am a reasonable man. I recognize skill when I see it, even in an enemy." "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah asked. "Single combat. You and me, sniper versus sniper. If you win, your team goes free. If I win, well, you understand the consequences." Brooks grabbed her arm and shook his head violently, but Sarah was already considering the proposition. Her team was trapped with limited ammunition and no realistic chance of fighting their way out against superior numbers. "Where and when?" she asked into the radio. "The old church on the hill between our positions. 1 hour. Bring only your rifle and basic equipment. My men will hold their positions and allow you safe passage." Sarah looked at her team members, seeing the mixture of admiration and fear in their eyes. They knew what she was considering, and they knew it was their best chance for survival. "Martinez, you can't do this," Brooks said quietly. "It's suicide." "Sir, it's our best option," Sarah replied. "Petrov is right about our tactical situation. We can't fight our way out, and we can't hide indefinitely." She began checking her equipment, ensuring her rifle was in perfect condition and that she had sufficient ammunition. The other team members watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. 30 minutes until I need to leave for the church," Sarah announced. "If I don't return or if something goes wrong, use the distraction to reach the tertiary extraction point." She spent those 30 minutes reviewing everything she knew about counter-sniper tactics, breathing exercises to control stress, and the wind patterns in the valley. This would be the ultimate test of everything she had learned, not just as a sniper, but as a soldier. As she prepared to leave for what might be her final mission, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. All the mockery, all the doubt, all the times she had been overlooked or dismissed because of her gender had led to this confrontation with one of the most dangerous snipers in the world. She picked up her rifle and looked at her teammates one final time. If I don't make it back, tell them that the woman they mocked earned their respect the hard way. With that, Sarah Martinez walked out of the hiding spot and toward the old church where her destiny waited.